James Gallo is with us. James, good afternoon, sir. Thanks so much for taking time for us.
Oh, there we go. Afternoon, fellas. How you guys doing today? It's chilly. Hey?
Oh, you want to come shovel my driveway, find out how cold it really is?
That's why we have kids.
Hey, fellas, I'm going to tell you something weird. James, you've traveled a number of times this way. Dave, I'm in Winnipeg. Show up to Winnipeg. There's no snow here.
No.
I'm thinking, like, I thought that band of snow was coming all the way to, down to the Great Lakes. We have no snow here. Now there's low cloud cover. It looks ominous. Like if I was going golfing today, I'd be packing the rain gear. So maybe we're going to get some, but roads are awful until about Portage La Prairie. If anyone's out there driving, slow and don't go if you don't have to.
Well, okay, let's back up the bus quite literally for a moment, because James, you've been on those roadies where weather sets in and you've got that bus driver who is doing such a great job in the middle of the night, in the middle of nowhere, doing his thing. Any road trips that you can recall that were a little off the rails, hopefully not off the highway?
I think everybody's got their own experiences. Those guys do a great job, those bus drivers. I had one, I think it might have been my first year, and we were traveling home from Prince George, going to the next destination, and I was the only one awake. I was working on my computer, and you just felt a little, the tail slide just a little bit on those roads, and I'm just gonna put my computer down and go to sleep. Right? I mean, enough's enough. But those guys do a great job. You know what? They full credit to the bus drivers across the Western Hockey League, SJHL. Through the winter months, they just do a great job getting teams where they need to be.
Okay, Barney, you were talking about the Tri-City Americans last night, right?
Yeah, James might get a chance to shed some light on this because they were close to his home base. What I heard, James, was they left the game in Swift Current, which would have been Tuesday night, and bus broke down near Chaplin. They couldn't get a new bus. They couldn't get parts, whatever, and they ended up sleeping on the bus. Now, I don't know. That's allegedly, right? I'm going to use the old Monday nooner, allegedly. What did you hear?
Maybe a little bit different in the story, but I would probably say what I heard is not too far off what you heard, Barney.
Okay,
allegedly.
Before we dive into what is happening, I can give you the proof of the tale of the road trip that isn't alleged. Back in the day, back when I was starting out, back when dinosaurs were still playing, all that stuff, make the old age joke like my kids would do here. The coach for the team, he sat at the front of the bus, and if you got beat, he'd be smoking up the cigarettes, right? So he'd go through a couple of darts before he even left the parking lot. And we're driving through a snowstorm, and the bus driver is looking at him because, of course, he's the head coach, so he's sitting in the front row. He's like, do you see the lines at all? And so he's trying to direct him with the lines. And at one point, he's so mad because the loss was terrible. He's like, yeah, I can see him. And he goes, well, what color it is? And he goes, I don't know, white, yellow, whatever. And so the bus driver starts swerving because he goes, what does it matter? He goes, well, it kind of matters what color the line is. So anyways, we arrived in Kindersley that night and all was well.
Those are on single lane highways probably too, hey? Like that's I'm fortunate enough to be traveling on double the whole way. Don't spend a lot of time on singles. So back those days, Dave, those would have been pretty interesting.
Well, let's talk a little bit about your team and the Moose Jaw Warriors. Of course, you're at home to the Saskatoon Blades tonight. Again, I anticipated, I would suggest, a slower start by the Warriors. 4 wins thus far in the season. Where is this team at where you projected them to be?
Yeah, that's a tough question, I think. It's a team that had 15 guys returning from last year's championship team. You don't lose Matthew Savoy and Atlee Calvert and Jagger Furcus and Denton Matejchuk and not take a step back. But of those 15 guys that are back, you'd have to look at the roster and say, how many of those guys played a lot of minutes last year? And there wasn't a lot. Right, the bulk of those guys, like Lyndon Lakovich, Braden Yager, they sat inside the top 6 last year. But a lot of guys right now are finding their way in the Western Hockey League, and they've got added responsibility, added ice time. I think consistently inconsistent might be the best way to put it. The best stat or that maybe describes the Warriors season is they are tied with the Saskatoon Blades for the most times going to the third period tied. So 9 times out of 21 games, the Saskatoon Blades and the Moose Jaw Warriors have been tied going into the third period. Here's the difference. The Warriors have a record of 1-6-1-1, and the Blades have a record of 6-3. So the Warriors have done a lot to be in opportunities to win. The tough part is just missing those, as the coaches describe, competitive moments, the moments before the big moments, to try and pick up those big key plays to get the big win.
I ran into General Manager Jason Ripplinger when you guys were out in British Columbia in town, and it seems everybody's going to British Columbia and finding out that things are pretty tough out there this year, James. What was the swing like for you, and is the BC division, pretty deep and for real this year?
The weather was nice. I can start there at some pretty nice locations out in BC. It's tough, right? I think haven't seen all the U.S. division teams yet. The BC division 1 through 5 looks pretty good. There's some pretty competitive teams out there. Some teams with a lot of strengths, some teams with some obvious weaknesses. But right now, that's a hard conference. I think the West, looks pretty loaded. Prince George, I think, is ready to make that push. It's probably the peak of their cycle with Cohen Zemer graduating after this year. Riley Height probably headed to the pros. Boria Vallis headed to the pros after this year. Everett, boy, they're good. That's probably the fastest team that I've seen. The Vancouver Giants, don't sleep on them. Probably the second fastest team that I've seen, the way they play. Connor Schmidt's the real deal. Cameron Schmidt for the Vancouver Giants. Cameron Schmidt, fast, and boy, can he shoot. There's some really good teams out west. And then, as you approach kind of that trade deadline, what did the Kelowna Rockets do? Sitting on guys like Tisha Ginla, Andrew Crystal, Caden Price. They got some really good players there. Does Bruce Hamilton want to load up? But, of course, I think a lot is probably tied up to that Memorial Cup decision, which I don't know when it's coming. But, the Kelowna Rockets are one of 5 teams trying to get the Memorial Cup next year. And that may change Bruce's perspective, but that's another great team to watch.
Interesting that you mentioned the Memorial Cup. Going to get into that question in just a moment. Of course, James Gallo joins us on the Western Pizza guest hotline. It's the all-new Sports Cage. We're streaming live at sportscage.com. Of course, you can hit us up on YouTube. Click like and subscribe. You can chime in with your comments. The Capital Ford Lincoln text line is always open as well at 306-936-6262. You've been in the Memorial Cup tournament last season with the Moose Jaw Warriors. Other leagues do it differently when it comes to bidding for the event, in that you have to be in a certain position in the standings to have the ability to bid for that tournament and that event, which seems natural to me, or am I wrong in that?
You never know, right? Because to me, it seems like I would view, like here in the Western Hockey League, they want to look at how you sit business-wise and how you sit hockey-wise. And I think, how teams vote, because it's voted by all 60 teams now, not just inside the league. How teams vote is their prerogative and what they put above each other. It's where you are in your cycle, right? I mean, look at the Medicine Hat Tigers. They're really good this year, but still could peak next year with Gavin McKenna, the expected first overall pick in next year's NHL entry draft. He's got the late birthday, so not eligible this year. The Brandon Wee Kings, they're pretty young, so I think it's tough for them in that regards on the hockey side. Kelowna, as I mentioned, we'll see what happens there. Spokane with Berkeley Catton, Saskatchewan product next year. Seattle Kraken picks. So. And the Lethbridge Hurricanes, I think, have a lot of guys back next year that could really make an impact. So you can get yourself really fast, really good too in today's day and age. You got to pay for it a little bit, obviously, but I don't mind it. I mean, it's tried and true here in the Western Hockey League, but those host teams are always a little different. I think you got to look at that way as well. No host team likes taking the back door in, and they load up to try and go through the front door, which I think is great.
You mentioned Berkeley Catton. We got Riley Height in Prince George. You got Caden Price in Kelowna. You got Braden Yeager. All those guys are intertwined, playing in the Saskatoon minor hockey system. A lot of people are talking Yeager is going to fetch a healthy price tag if he gets moved. Could you see any of that playing into it, James, where, and I know, we call it in the NHL, guys can, with no trade clauses and whatnot, they can say junior hockey is a little bit different. But would you ever see, and have he ever heard in the past where a kid will say, hey, I'd like to go play with my buddy one more time if there's anything you can do there?
I don't know. I can't speak to the Braden Yager situation. That's in the mind of Jason Ripplinger, our general manager. But maybe, right? There's probably cases where guys would say, I'm playing in this place. I'd rather be, in at home or as close to home, or, I've got a lot of buddies that are with this team. I'd like to go there. But, the one thing you got to think, Barney, too, is with these elite guys, look at Matthew Savoy last year. Matthew Savoy knew Braden Yager, knew Denton Matejchuk, knew Jagger Firkus, and knew pretty well half of the Moose Jaw Warriors team. Why? Because they all know each other. Right? I mean, It doesn't matter where you're from. Your paths cross at some point. So most guys have a number of really good friends on each team. So I really don't think that really comes into a play that much.
Before I give you a moment to marinate on the thought of some of the greatest trades of all time, I'm giving you, this is your 3-minute warning, so to speak. But if for folks that may have missed it, Tanner Howe was traded. The captain of the Regina Pats was dealt to the Calgary Hitmen. The way that the deal was done is that it was agreed upon by both teams at 6:35 last night. So just before the Pats were heading out onto the ice for their pregame skate, at which point Tanner Howe was notified that he was going to be traded and was pulled off the ice. It was a very emotional moment. You'll hear this conversation that occurred between player and coach coming up with the general manager of the Regina Pats, coming up with Alan Miller in just a few moments' time. But the timing of this, some would say that, if you waited until January, when that trade deadline is approaching, maybe you can go ahead and get more teams bidding against one another, which would maybe maximize your return. However, I point to last season where the Saskatoon Blades were very proactive and went and acquired Fraser Minton at this time last year before the World Junior Camp so that they could have him in town to learn their systems before he headed out. So the timing of this one isn't really related to that, but it kind of is. Do you think that this, though, adjusts any timelines that there might be for the Moose Jaw Warriors to decide what they're going to do with a player the likes of Yager, or what they might do with their roster shaping it forward?
I think that's a really good question. I think, every general manager, when it comes to dealing, A, they're hard. Trades are hard to accomplish. B, we have to adhere to the WHL trade deadline, which is, kind of mid-January. But then I think general managers will put their own deadlines in, right? Like, look at Curtis Hunt, who, general manager of the Prince Albert Raiders, had Caden Gooley one year, had Nolan Allen the next. And, again, I've never talked to Curtis about this, but maybe Curtis said, this is my deadline. If you are interested in one of these guys, I want it done by this day because I want my assets back over the World Junior time, right? But then there's some guys that maybe feel a little bit more comfortable that, hey, maybe my guy can go look at, the Wenatchee Wild last year. Maybe their timeline was the January 10th deadline because they felt that having Connor Geekie and Matthew Savoy play in the World Juniors might enhance their value. So I think it's case to case. It's whatever general manager prefers. In our case, Jason Ripplinger, when he took over the team in 2020, he had a plan and he had a vision, and he didn't deter from that. I think he had chances to, but he stuck with his plan, and his plan ended with a Western Hockey League championship. So whatever Jason's plan is moving forward, I think it's just a matter of trusting his plan. And I think you guys would agree too that every general manager, when he takes over a team, he'll say, I have a 3-year plan or I have a 5-year plan. Sometimes when they deviate is when things necessarily go wrong. I think sometimes you're forced to deviate because things are going really well. For Jason, in his 4 years since he took over in 2020, he did not deviate, right? You think about 2 years ago, the last year that Ryder Korzak was with the Warriors as a 20-year-old. They lost to Winnipeg in the second round. Great series. Could Jason have used assets that year to improve his team, to maybe make that push to try and, potentially knock off Winnipeg and then maybe a Kamloops or Seattle? Maybe. His plan was to load up for the following year, which was last year. So you stick with your plan and you go with it. And it's the same thing with what you have, whether you're acquiring players or whether you're trading players. General managers will have their deadline in their mind because that's their plan. And a general manager, for all we know, the Calgary Hitmen might have said, we want this trade done before the World Juniors because we want to, if Tanner Howe has the potential to go to a World Junior camp, maybe make Team Canada, we want some games to get him acclimated into our system. I don't know, but maybe that's the case. So every guy's different, but you got to find a dancing partner. And, for the Pats and the Hitmen, that's just twice that they found, the right moves and they fit in.
I would love to be a fly on the wall in a lot of this. And it's a lot like buying stock or property. And when do you sell, right? Okay, do we hang on? Do we sell? It's very similar. James, question to you. I've asked some of the other guys around the league this in the last week. Where do you think, and then Dave, you've been around too, and you'll remember the Braden Shen trade. Where do you think things in the Western Hockey League really took off as far as capital being exchanged? Was it, we didn't see a lot of 2 first-rounders. I think the Cale Clegg maybe comes to mind in that, Gooley, like you said. The Western Hockey League always seemed to be a little bit behind. We saw the Tavares trade in Ontario. We saw even Lindros, right? We go back. Which one in the WHL do you feel really pre-Zellweger took it to another level?
I think you're right, Barney. I think the Western Hockey League has always been very conservative. The abnormal trades were the Braden Shen and Cody Eakin deals, where there was a lot of picks and or prospects involved. I think but back then it's different because, in that era, you could trade import picks. You could trade 16-year-olds. You could trade, 15-year-olds. Yeah. That is not the case now. If I had to pinpoint a time, I would look to the 17-18 season. It was an arms race between, the Regina Pats, who were hosting the Memorial Cup, the Moose Jaw Warriors and the Swift Current Broncos. And I would look to the first trade that kind of kicked it all off was when the Broncos, they acquired Beck Mallenstein and, the name I apologize, but it was Beck Mallenstein, another player from the Calgary Hitmen. And it was Riley Stotts was the big prospect going back to the Calgary Hitmen in that trade. And that one was a big trade. It was massive. You're talking multiple firsts, multiple prospects, and it was just huge. And from then on out, when guys had players, then you had like the Jake Bean trade. You had the Cale Clegg trade that year. The Tanner Kaspick trade was that year. And since then, the prices have just stayed in that line. And I think it's tough for general managers because their tradable assets are not as much as what fans think that they have. Right? There's not as much tradable assets as what fans think that they have. And when you're talking about moving a 17-year-old like Reese Hamilton, he's got to waive his no trade. He's an elite prospect, right, as well. You got to consider that. There's a lot of things that go into completing a trade like that Tanner Howe trade.
Well, we're going to go ahead and get to trades, I promise, in just a moment, but should introduce the gang. Barney is hanging out in a closet in Winnipeg, and we got James Gallo, the voice of the Moose Jaw Warriors. The double C's and Allen are on the other side of the cameras today on the all-new SportsCage, streaming at sportscage.com. So one thing that you mentioned was the impact that those trades out east have, and I'll get both of your thoughts on this. And again, Barney, you've got a youngster, players that have gone on to play elite levels, and the Bantam draft is such a consideration right now. But if you're talking about the OHL or the Q, it wasn't a Bantam draft that they held, right? It was basically a prospect that you could draft the following year. So when you're trading a first-round pick, you're likely trading a pick for a player that's going to be in that team's lineup the following year. So as a fan, is it easier to digest me knowing that, hey, I have just traded one of my elite players, understanding that my team needs to gain some assets moving forward, and knowing that I don't have to wait 2 years to see him play for my team, but I might be able to see him next year? Does that change the thinking as far as the fans, or should it?
I guess this is the culture that we're used to, and the Western Hockey League holding their draft at the age that they have it. I think, again, sorry to sound repetitive, but it's tried and true. And, in the OHL, you can't trade first round picks, right? So teams
Yeah.
are protected. They're protected that way. I believe it's the same in the Q. In the Western Hockey League, you cannot trade signed 15 or 16-year-old players. They are off the board. And in the past, those guys were always on the board. For me, I like the draft age where it is. I can compare it a little bit to the National Hockey League in a sense of, the Moose Jaw Warriors draft Braden Yager in 2020. He signs. He's now under their umbrella, right? There's opportunities. Each team is different, but the Moose Jaw Warriors have, players drafted in May. The Warriors will have a development camp in May. They'll have the player in likely over Christmas time if they're not at the max. Then they have they'll have a training camp in the fall. And then you have a development camp again in May. And then you have another training camp. So before that player can actually play for your team, he will have been seen by the coaches 5 times. And it's 5 times, and it's probably a year and a half where the team should have and potentially could have an impact on that player's development, calling them up and down, just getting them around the room. The Warriors have 3 prospects that are just across the hallway from them right now, and that helps. And that to me is why I like it the way it is. So that young player at 15 has basically a year to see what the culture is like and to try and meet players and get involved in the organization instead of just opening the doors on day one and say, here I am, love me or hate me.
Yeah, I agree. I like that too. Just kind of in the scope where I am and seeing these youngsters, right? Like we're starting a Bantam AAA tournament tonight. And there are so many kids in that hockey rink for the next 4 days that will get drafted with some of the picks that we've seen over the last 2 years. There's no doubt about it. The other thing that I started thinking about yesterday was I wonder the trades in the Western Hockey League, maybe down the road, maybe not this year, on how much the NCAA transfer is going to play into a lot of things and how much due diligence you're going to have to do to find out, okay, how long do we have this kid? Like, how much do we know? It's almost like, CSI. You're going to have to go deep on it because the rumor that's floating around on a number of places is the possibility of Gavin McKenna next year going to play NCAA because because there's just nothing more for him to do in the Western Hockey League. And I'm like, well, that's a low schedule. The NHL teams like the Western League guys. They're grind, tried and tested. I'm just curious on this NCAA thing too, and the scouting that's going to have to go into things at all ages. I feel is going to be interesting over the next few years.
Okay, we are going to hear from General Manager Alan Miller of your Regina Pats in a moment. James Gallo from the Moose Jaw Warriors before we let you go. Best trade, all-time, any sport you can pick and show your allegiance because it was great for your team or terrible for your team. If you had to pick a trade that goes down as the best of all time, what are you going to say?
Are you saying best trade or most memorable trade?
See, it's 2 different things. It's your definition. It's your game here, man. Best, whatever you want. Best is best.
You know what? I'm not gonna say this is. There's been a lot of trades that I've seen and I've had conversations. I think like the Nikita Papagayev trade to Prince George for Justin Almeida was a great trade. Alan Miller made that one. I think the Matthew Savoy trade by Jason Riplinger last year was absolutely fantastic to get a player like that without having to utilize any young talent. But for me, the most memorable trade for me is a Moose Jaw Warrior trade made many moons ago, and it was one where it involved Brooks Lake and Thomas Mojes going to the Seattle Thunderbirds, and the return was Craig Olenek, who was a nice guy to deal with. Don't get me wrong, enjoyed being with him. And I'm not picking on Craig at all. But the trade I think was in like in October, November. He didn't score his first goal until February with the Warriors, and then there was a highly touted import player from Russia, Stanislav Oksentiev. I'll never forget the name. He never came. I don't think he touched Canadian soil. Right, so that's a hard trade. It's one that always stands out in my mind because Mojes and Lake were 2 World Junior players, and that's a tough pill to swallow.
Moose Jaw Warriors Saskatoon Blades coming up at the Moose Jaw Event Center. Quickly set it up for me. Going to be a good one, right?
Should be fun. Always is. It's a nice rivalry between these two teams. And just a heads up as well, guys, Warriors Hall of Fame is tomorrow night, Friday. Dustin Boyd and Jody Lehman in the players category, and the Moose Jaw Multiplex Builders, who raised $10 million to build our brand new home, all being inducted into our Hall of Fame tomorrow.
Sensational stuff. James, thanks so much. Have a great call tonight. I owe you one.
Anytime, guys. Anytime. Have a nice day.